Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to part three as we look at the first portion of Christianity. And we left off with the Passion, the Resurrection, and the Ascension. Of course, really a bit of the Passion here. And the next point happened to be shown there at the very end of my previous video. I happened to click the button that showed the next point, but I didn't get to comment on it. But that is, after the death of Jesus, his followers claimed that he had been resurrected. According to how the Jewish people dated dates, this would have been 3 days after Jesus' death, where his followers claim that he rose from the dead, the resurrection, which is celebrated within the holiest day of the year for Christians, which is Easter, or as it's called in the East, the Pesha, day of the resurrection. And sometime after his resurrection, Jesus ascends to heaven, where the belief is one day that he will return. So, sometime after the resurrection of Jesus, the number that's given is 40 in the book of Acts, but this was a culture and, of course, their use of numbers. But some amount of time after the resurrection, the belief is that Jesus ascends to heaven, what's known as the ascension. And then there is the belief that one day Jesus will return, which is what is known as the second coming of Jesus. So, little bit move into the historical Jesus. There's not really much I want to mention here. It's not really anything you need to write down per se, but I have here the question below an icon of Jesus. Is the Christ of faith the Jesus of history, or who really was Jesus of Nazareth? And there was a historical Jesus. I do need to mention that. And to focus on that a little bit more, I do not know one credible scientist, not one, that holds that the world is 6,000 years old. Likewise, I do not know one credible historian, not one, who holds that Jesus of Nazareth did not exist. Now, we do, of course, wonder as historians, how much of what is in his life is in, the realm of history versus the realm of faith versus, perhaps what his followers wanted to, like maybe some of the words what his followers wanted to put into his mouth versus what he actually said, et cetera, et cetera. There are questions relating to that, but not his historical existence. And I've noticed that even those that question the existence of Jesus, when they are shown the evidence to the contrary, they will backpedal and acknowledge his existence, but they find that what is in the Gospels is not historically reliable. But regardless of which, they do acknowledge his existence. But like I said, there was a historical Jesus that started all this, or to put it another way, there was a wandering first century Jewish preacher who started this whole thing that we call Christianity, Jesus from the town of Nazareth. But there are questions relating to, how much of what is believed by Jesus or about Jesus, I should say, to be, what he really was in his real life on earth. But now let's look at a new individual that comes onto the scene, the Apostle Paul. Born Jewish and as Saul in Tarsus, he transliterated his name to the Greek version of Paul. The word Paul, it's just the Greek version for the word Saul, and he was born Jewish, tribe of Benjamin, if I remember correctly. But his transliteration of his name to Paul was really, his working with the Gentiles, the non Jews, and Greek, of course, being one of their dominant languages. Paul, he was originally an opponent of the Christian faith, but he became a Christian during an incident that took place on the road to Damascus. Paul, he does mention this, though he does not go into any details in his letter to the Galatians, whereas the book of Acts, which is written by Luke and traditionally a disciple of Paul, though some historians question that relationship between the author of Luke Acts and Paul, but regardless, um, the account is essentially that on the road to Damascus, Paul encountered this light and he's knocked off his horse and he hears the words, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And then he asks, well, who is this? And the individual responds back, I'm Jesus of Nazareth, whom you persecute. Um, Historically speaking, we can't say that Paul encountered Jesus, but we can say that Paul had some type of experience where he believed that he did. We can say, for certain from a historical point of view, that he encountered something. And Paul himself held that he encountered the resurrected Jesus. While not originally part of Jesus' earthly ministry, Paul, he emerged to be the second most important leader of the early Christian community after Peter. Along with Peter, Paul is recognized as a co-founder of the bishopric or the diocese of Rome. So Paul, he wasn't part of Jesus' earthly ministry, but he emerged to be the second most important leader of the early Christian movement after Peter. Along with the Apostle Peter, he's recognized as a co founder of the Bishopric of Rome, the Diocese of Rome. Um, the Bishop of Rome, who we commonly refer to as the Pope, is recognized as the successor to Saints Peter and Paul. As I am recording this, the current successor to Saints Peter and Paul is Leo the 14th. Leo the 14th is recognized, if we make Peter and Paul one individual here, he's recognized as the 266th successor to Saints Peter and Paul, or the 267th Bishop of Rome. And also, I'd say that the relationship between Peter and Paul, kind of shown by this early Christian image, was not maybe always pleasant. Um, I think of in the letter to the Galatians, where what's known as the Antioch incident, where Paul confronts Peter on his actions towards the Gentiles, the non-Jews, when James, Jesus's brother slash kinsman, arrives. Um, Paul confronts him on his attitude and tells him that he's wrong, but we don't know, because Paul certainly was not going to report it, but we don't know. But Peter might have said back, you know what, Paul, you're out of line on this. And it is interesting, in Paul's letter to the Romans, he does not mention Peter, and there may be some reasons why for that, and some of it may have been from the incident that took place at Antioch, but he does mention how, he's, you know, adding on to somebody's foundation that was already there, and more than likely that person that's referenced is Peter. Of the 14 letters of the canonical New Testament that are attributed to Paul, historians question half that number. Traditionally, there are 14 letters of the canonical New Testament that are said to be written by Paul. But historians, contemporary historians, question half that number. One of them, the letter to the Hebrews, has essentially been removed completely as a Pauline letter. Just to kind of add something to that, I belong to a liturgical church tradition, so I can remember during the scripture readings as part of the liturgy, the lector would come up and state, I can remember this as a teenager, a reading from the letter of St. Paul to the Hebrews. Whereas today, and those of you that belong to a liturgical church tradition would probably, be aware of this also. Now it's just a reading from the letter to the Hebrews. Historians, they've often seen Paul as a second founder of Christianity. The argument essentially here is that Paul took this early movement started by Jesus and he took it in a totally different direction that Jesus perhaps may not have necessarily agreed upon. And that really relates heavily to the next point, which is the main theme of Paul's theology is that the death of Jesus did away with the Jewish Torah slash law. Um, to emphasize this point, I was one time browsing around the internet, needed something to do, and I just decided to go and look up, what do Jewish people think about Jesus? Now, granted, I know, I pretty much knew overall their views, but I just needed something to read, to kill time. And I think this was from a Reddit forum where, some mentioned how, um, they don't see, him fulfilling the messianic requirements, but other than that, he seemed like a likable guy. Others like, we don't really think much of him. We don't focus on him. And there was one that posted something along the lines of how, well, if he had any notion to get rid of any of the 613 commandments of the law or slash the Torah, well, then according to chapter 13 of Deuteronomy, he's a heretic. Um, you can't completely make that case regarding Jesus, but you certainly can make it regarding Paul and his attitude. Um, Paul essentially held that the death of Jesus, and you can see this really well laid out in the letter to the Galatians, which would be kind of the starting point of this, that the death of Jesus did away with the Jewish commandment, the Torah, the law. And that was an issue that was very, very prominent in early Christianity, the attitude regarding the Torah, the law. And I would say that one reason why the Ten Commandments are still, in use by Christians may have had to do perhaps with Peter making, a bit of a middle ground, um, an arrangement between the attitude of Paul and the attitude of James, Jesus's brother slash kinsman, who, and you can see this in the book of Acts, was kind of big in maintaining a lot of those laws, to say, okay, we'll maintain the 10 here, but the others will, disregard. Well, we will continue on a little bit later here in just a moment with more of the first portion of Christianity.